Press the record button. Here we go. Okay. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming along to our webinar this evening. I see we've got nearly 200 people tuning in already. We've got a couple more who have registered. So they will come in, no doubt, in the next few minutes. So thank you very much again for coming along. We have a very exciting and interesting webinar for you this evening. I hope it'll be a very interesting discussion. If it's your first time joining in to one of our webinars, my name is Pádraig. I'm the campaign officer with the Irish Wildlife Trust. The IWT is a national conservation charitable organisation, and our mission is to raise awareness of the importance of wildlife to people's lives. So you can visit our website, iwt.ie, and you'll see quite a lot of material there. You'll find all of our past webinars that we've been doing since last autumn, blogs, and so on and so forth. So lots of information there. And please do consider joining the Irish Wildlife Trust. We try to keep all these things free, but obviously your support is very much appreciated and welcome. And so please do join up, and you'll get a copy of our magazine. The spring issue is due out this week or next week. So, so a very good time to do that. We are recording this webinar this evening, just to let you know, and we'll be posting it onto our YouTube channel, and a link to that will be on social media probably towards the end of this week, maybe this weekend. You can watch it back. Just to let you know, in terms of questions and answers, or questions rather, if you have a question that you want to pose, what we'll do is we'll bunch them all to the end. So please put your question into the Q&A button. You'll see at the bottom of the screen there, the Q&A button, put your question there. Please don't put your question into the chat, because I won't be monitoring the chat necessarily, and so I may miss your question if you do that. Okay, so without further ado, we're going to talk this evening about nature in Dublin. And I think this is a really fascinating and interesting area to look at, because I think for so long we have seen nature as something that is in the countryside, and that cities are not really the place for nature, and that, you know, things like foxes or pigeons that manage to live in the city are doing it despite our best efforts. But of course, nearly all of our cities in Dublin are by the sea, and we have parks and green spaces. We have a lot of waterways and rivers flowing through our cities. And of course, we're getting increasing evidence of the importance of contact with nature for our physical and mental health. And I think that's something, certainly for me, that has come out strongly in the coronavirus crisis, our absolute need for contact with clean air and greenery and space, and I think I hope that will be a greater focus of our attention as we plan our cities into the future. So we have three fantastic speakers for you this evening, and first up is Dr. Alma Clavin, who is an urban geographer and a planner with a specialist interest in well-being in sustainable urban environments. Since late 2019, Alma has been working in University College Dublin in the geography department on an environmental protection agency funded project to develop a community greening strategy in Dublin 8. And we look forward to hearing about that. So Alma, in your own time, please.
Okay, I'll just share a screen now, Pádraig, right?
That's wonderful, yeah, we can all see that.
All good, yes?
Yeah, great.
Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Alma Clavin. I am an urban geographer, as Pádraig has just said. I work at the School of Geography in UCD. And this evening, I'll be talking mainly about an EPA-funded project called Greening the City, which began in February 2019 and is now nearing completion. So the first aim of this project was to map the trees in Dublin City in order to examine the associated ecosystem services, so the benefits we obtain from nature and healthy ecosystems. The second aim of the project was to create a greening strategy with the community using this data. So as a group, we are artists, designers, activists, academics, and residents of Dublin. We view this as a new approach to strategy making. So we realize there are various other greening strategies in Dublin. This one is very much grounded in the community, collaboration, and broader ideas of social and environmental justice. So to achieve this, we teamed up with an arts organisation, Common Ground, based in Inchicore, and their artist in residence, Jodine O'Sullivan, to bring a critically grounded and ecological dimension to the work. And our other partner is Connect the Dots, who have a specialised interest in stakeholder engagement. And we also have the support of Ronan Foley, a health geographer in Maynooth, and various other academic partners in UCD. So much of the work we have done since 2019 can be viewed on our website, and it's there, mappinggreendublin.com. And this is going to be updated in the next few weeks as the work has culminated in the final community greening strategy. And I'll be showing you much of this content today. So as I said, the project has sort of three main phases. The first is data mapping of trees and green spaces in Dublin. The second, the co-creation phase, where we bring this data to the community to elicit conversations and support communities to articulate their greening needs. And finally, and most importantly, the action phase, the setting up of a community greening forum in Dublin 8 and the publication of a community greening strategy due to be published in the next few weeks, so late March, early April, hopefully. So I suppose this is the first public outing of our recommendations pre-publication. So I'll just go through these stages one by one. So hopefully there's something here for everyone. The tools are all on our website, and as are the findings up until this point. So I'll start off talking about the mapping work. This work was carried out by Professor Gerald Mills and Tina Ningle at UCD, both urban climatologists and cartographers. So they started counting trees, so digitizing trees in Dublin one by one, trees being the most visible and often emotive element of greening and green infrastructure in our cities, also a symbol of hope in the face of a changing climate. So there are about 300,000 trees of all sizes across the city of Dublin. Highest density of trees to be found in the large parks and in the suburban areas with large garden sizes. The fewest trees are found in the city centre, probably no surprise there, and in commercial areas in suburban locations. About 40% of trees are found along roads and in public parks. The remainder are located in private gardens, so over 30%. And on private lands such as schools and golf courses. The largest trees, the oldest, are found in parks. Of course, we have Phoenix Park, St. Anne's Park, and the smallest in private gardens. So that's just a sort of summary of some of the work that has been done. So this entire database of trees in Dublin is freely available and open source, and the link is available there. So Tina and Gerald also mapped the canopy cover in Dublin. Okay, and this shows estimated tree heights in Dublin city. Note the taller trees, again, located in parks, but also along some streets, such as in Bulls Bridge. So the majority of trees are between 5 and 15 meters tall. That's 57%. 10% are taller, and the very largest, so that's greater than 25 meters, represent only about 0.5% of trees in Dublin. So now we start talking about people. The distribution of trees in residential neighbourhoods is seen to be highly variable. In the city centre, there are about 10 people per tree, but in low density suburbs, there is 1 person per tree. And the geographic patterns reflect historic patterns of housing and ownership across the city, alongside the development of the urban parks system. So as I said, all of these maps will be available on our website, but also in our greening strategy. So a simple measure of neighbourhood ranking for trees is presented in this map, and it is based on population density, tree cover, and traffic intensity. So specifically, ranking is based on population size, average traffic number, and tree cover in each grid cell. So you can see high ranking is associated with high population, high traffic flow, and low tree count. And there are the red areas you see in the map. So as you will see, our study area here in Dublin 8, or part of Dublin 8 anyway, does not have the lowest tree cover or trees per person in Dublin city. You can see a greater deficit perhaps in the northeast of the city, and I know DCC are carrying out a greening strategy in that area. But what Dublin 8 does have is a very high traffic flow and associated traffic burden, which is very much felt by the communities there. And of course, trees play a part in offsetting this burden. So again, just to zoom in, this is our study area. This is not the postcode area of Dublin 8. I know drawing a line on a map is a very emotive thing. We see this as a porous boundary, but we have examined Kilmainham, Inchicore, across Trialto, down to Dolphin's Barn, and up to the Liberties. So the number of trees per person in this area is 0.22. And about half of that for the rest of the city, as was examined. The average hourly traffic rate in this area is 295 vehicles compared with 191 elsewhere. Okay, so a very large traffic burden in this area, pointing to the fact that perhaps we need to be taking into account transport infrastructure and tree infrastructure at the same time. So again, just to finish off this phase of the process, the work that is still being carried out in UCD aims to map all of the species within the city, but also within the study area, leaning on the work being carried out currently by DCC and others using the Curio app, where you can actually map the species of trees in your private space or elsewhere, which all adds to the database. So as I said, this is part of some ongoing work that is being carried out on carbon sequestration by tree species and leaf type, showing the potential for this type of work in examining carbon removal. So we took all of this scientific and strategic data to the communities of Dublin 8, with a view again to supporting them in articulating their community needs and developing a different type of greening strategy. So again, here is our study area. So according to the last census, which of course is 2016, there's over 44,000 people in this area, which seems like quite a lot. A total of 59.78% reside in flats and apartments. So you might say these people have an even greater need for access to public trees and green space. So we had quite a grounded approach to the greening strategy, which actually was quite beneficial because during the first 3 months of this project, of course, we had to deal with the global pandemic. But overall, the process can be broken down into 3 components. The first is the presentation of the data, which I have presented to you so far. The next component is to listen and to expand ideas from the community, and then to reground. And this took the shape of, first of all, a greening forum within the area, and then secondly, the greening strategy. So as I said, the first phase was very much a listening phase to find out if we were actually asking the right questions. And one of the first things that came up was that people were saying to us, well, what is green structure, green infrastructure, and what spaces are we talking about here? So there was a desire for a map of green spaces and public land, so people could try and understand, well, what places are ours for planting. So that's quite an important point. The purple circles there indicate areas of deficit, and the orange spaces indicate areas where people were quite happy with and saw ecological strength. So we saw that it was important to build on those strengths as well as think about the deficits and opportunities. And of course, the participants didn't just want to talk about trees and green spaces. They also wanted to talk about the associated dimensions of cycling, of walking, of sitting, of being in nature, play spaces, sports, etc. Okay, and there were many comments around cars and pollution in the area, which is no surprise given the commuter traffic in the area. So these are just some images of our launch event, which took place in March last year, just before the restrictions were put in place, of course. So most of the recommendations we received from our open mapping project were around, of course, green space trees, but also cycling and walking. So what we did here is we rolled out large A0 sheets and mapped all the trees in Dublin and digitized all the trees in Dublin so people could identify where all the trees were. And here are just some of the results that we can see. So there's about 250 comments altogether. What we did was we developed 9 maps, which we then put online on social media to elicit further comments for those people who couldn't be there on the 7th of March. And of course, we were restricted ourselves in our participation processes due to COVID-19. So the most important thing that came from our event on March the 7th was the setting up of a community greening forum. So we had about 35 people who wanted to be part of this greening forum, and we now have 13 people who are activated. So interestingly, out of about the 265 comments that we received, and these are more qualitative comments rather than quantitative yes, no answers, people were most concerned about issues of health and well-being. Okay, so for example, how pollution and traffic can impact on their health and well-being, and how in turn trees and green space can improve their health and well-being. And of course, this is very much associated with connectivity and access, so getting around. Again, many comments around governance. Okay, so the need to support existing groups to share data with the community and to harness the skills that are within that community. So there is quite a rich social capital and rich network of communities within Dublin 8. There was very much an emphasis on supporting the community to improve the public realm. Okay, many wanted to see no spray policy and a more wilding of green environments. There's definitely a feeling that the area is being intensified and densified, and that's no surprise given the amount of construction that is happening in the area, the new Children's Hospital, the Guinness site, and various other housing complexes being developed in the area. So very much an emphasis on development pressure and a pollution burden within the area, which trees and green space, of course, can help to ameliorate. But what we noticed here was that no huge changes are being asked for. The community weren't asking for a large piece of green infrastructure. I think they were asking more for support for what's there, to examine the underutilized spaces that are there, to map them, and yes, to work with DCC going forward. Just to say something briefly about the impact of COVID-19 in our work, it's, as anybody who works with community groups will know that engagement has been quite difficult over the last year. So luckily, because we were working with the arts organisation and the artist there, Shodine O'Sullivan, they set up this brilliant project called Plots, where people mapped their 2-kilometre radius within the city and detailed how the green space and trees were recovered and rediscovered in the area during this time. So very nice work. And just to give a little bit more detail about working with an arts organization and an artist, particularly during a time of crisis, what we see is that working with artists can actually reconfigure our own, say, perspectives as academics, but also reconfigure the perspectives of the community on ecology and green space. So what artists bring for us is a visual element that can be critical to greening work and very successful in reconfiguring perspectives of local people. And this is some of the work Common Ground and Shodine do in the local community. This is Mercy Secondary School. So now getting to the third stage, which is the action stage of the project, and probably the most important stage. So we have this really great group of 13 people, 13 individuals in the local area, which I think they weren't really connected before the project, but they certainly had projects in mind. And I wouldn't want to take any credit for the work done by these individuals. Many of them have projects that are in process. What we have, for example, is a very active space in Turvey Park, where many individuals are now getting involved during and between the lockdowns to improve that space, and they're working with DCC on that. We have pocket forests, pocket parks, so lots of these small incremental changes. We have ideas around a pilgrim park for the area, so this is a Camino for Dublin 8, a Fun Afloat project, which is a water-based activity for young people along the canal, a D8 bench project where people can be in nature in different parts of Dublin 8, can have a different bench. There are many ideas and comments around the canal maintenance and activation, and much emphasis on the development of intergenerational green space. So just before I finish up, what we did then was we took all of these community recommendations and all of the projects as developed by the Greening Forum to a number of policy and policymakers and practitioners. So I suppose in a way there's another greening community in the area and in other parts of Dublin who are working with trees and green space. So DCC, Waterways Ireland. We also interviewed individuals from the housing complex, community development workers. We interviewed individuals, some of the large landowners in the area, like the New Children's Hospital. So we did about 13 interviews before Christmas and analysed this work. And I'll just share with you some of the main findings around improving greening in the area. The first is increased communication. So having an online program of tree maintenance in the area, because what we found, people were coming to us whenever a tree would be cut down. So opening up the communication there about why certain trees are being maintained or indeed taken out. To enhance public understanding of civic structures. So many people in the area didn't really know how decisions about green space were being made, and this was a cause for frustration. There is a call to use more sophisticated and enhanced 3D visualization to improve communications about greening in the area. So for example, you can have quite sophisticated communications in visualizing the docklands or for rafting in Dublin City, but why can't we use that sort of technology to reimagine community spaces within Dublin City? So that calls for a more constructive collaboration, and that's real collaboration with a purpose between the main landholders in the area and DCC and NGOs such as IWT, of course. There was also a further theme around social infrastructure. And one of the main points that came from talking to the youth and communication workers in the area was that there really is a need to enhance a sense of ownership in the area, particularly amongst young people. That if there is that sense that they have a say in what's going on in a particular space, particular green space, then they will look after that space. Okay.
2 minutes there, Alma, please.
Okay, thank you. Also, there was another theme around ecological literacy, so connecting up nature within the area, and also a focus on human connectedness, and a greater call for leadership and support, and also more resources, so more arborists, more biodiversity officers, etc. And just finally to say before I finish up, I think it's fair to say that many people are, do have consultation fatigue, and we all know that. And many people in the area are tired of responding to consultations. And for example, in terms of the canal, there was a 2010 Scott Wilson report which emphasized community involvement, and many people are still waiting to see many of these recommendations to be actually implemented in the area. And this is my last slide, and some of these are my own perspectives. So just, if I may, some messages from our greening forum about the way forward. So a very active group over the last year, and they do emphasize action, okay, rather than another report or another plan, just getting out there and doing it, and also just getting young people involved and developing intergenerational spaces for everyone. In UCD, we would really like to see trees seen as an infrastructure in themselves, part of a wider ethic and infrastructure of urban care in our city. And I was at a webinar the other day by the Royal Irish Academy about our housing crisis, and they were purporting 1,000 tiny solutions to our housing crisis, and I would advocate the same here. There needs to be many different solutions to greening, and I realize not everybody in Dublin 8 or in other parts of Dublin want to be involved in a community greening project, for example, but we do have to create the opportunities for those who do, or those who might, taking into account not just the binary of the green and the grey, but also many different colors, okay, blue infrastructure, brown soils, everything, okay. And that leads on to a sort of a more expansive imaginary for what the future of greening might be, a sort of a wilder imagination. And I'm going to leave it there because I'm probably over time.
That was wonderful, Alma. Thank you so much. Great to see such fantastic engagement, I think, in the people that you worked with, and the focus on action, of course. And I think for once we're seeing some major investments in public transport and the public realm, and there will be opportunities hopefully after coronavirus to implement the 1,000 solutions that you refer to. So thanks for that. Next up, we have Patrick Mccabe. Hi, Patrick. I think you're there, are you?
Yeah, Porrick, I'm here.
Very good. Patrick is a landscape architect with over 20 years of international experience, both in the Netherlands and here in Ireland. He is director, founder of Redscape Landscape and Urbanism. And Patrick led a team of Dutch offices to collaborate a study called Irish Rivers 2040 into exploring adapted approaches to flood defences at a national level in Ireland. And one case study in particular that is very relevant to what we're talking about tonight is of the River Camach in South Dublin. And his study reveals that more than 50% of the flood requirement could be solved by redesigning existing green areas instead of building walls. And I think that is an issue that is raising a lot of emotion these days as we all come to terms with climate change and flooding. So Patrick, thank you, and over to you in your own time.
Yeah, thanks very much, Porrick. I'm going to share this document here. Hopefully everyone can see it.
Yeah, we can see that.
That's
Thank
great.
you.
Okay. Yeah, Porrick. Just to let everybody know, my name is Patrick Mccabe, and working for Redscape. Basically, I don't know if a lot of people know what landscape architects do. There's many different kinds. We tend to work on public projects. So we do types of projects like, for example, the Greenport, green infrastructure projects. It's about 3.5 kilometers down the Talca estuary along the north side of the port. We also work in things like heritage projects here, you can see on the right-hand side, and also down here, Temple Bar Square, public realm projects. And finally, we also work on research projects like the Irish rivers that I'm going to tell you a little bit about, and also other kinds of themes, for example, green chemistry, where we actually investigate other means of producing products for chemicals, essentially, to replace oil-based products and carbon-based products. And that's the research we did for the south of the Netherlands for the chemical industry there, and what the effects are for landscape. So Porrick has asked me to talk a little bit about the flooding study we did. Flooding, as you know, in Ireland is a serious problem, particularly in our cities and our towns. That's where a lot of the flooding is taking place. We're traditionally located on the rivers. That was the form of movement and mobility in the Irish landscape when many towns and cities were founded. And we put together a team of Dutch designers and design offices. And we teamed up with the OPW, Dublin City Council, and Cork City Council and Fingal County Council. And we wanted to start a research really into so-called design-led flood defenses in this country. And that's a slightly different approach to engineering-led approach to design. And we developed a number of case studies, about 4, in fact, looking at various different areas. You see them here. We looked at the coast. We looked at the River Camach. We looked down in Cork city centre to show how water could influence the urban form itself in developing new urban areas. And we also looked at the contact with the river in general in the city centres and town centres around the country, and looked at different approaches for that as well. So I'm going to talk about the Camach here, the story of a lost river. Dublin has 30 underground rivers, and they have the absolute potential to become a new backbone of the regional blue-green infrastructure of the region, connecting the city with the environ and the surrounding countryside. And this is a story about revitalizing the Camach. And you see here in the map many of these different rivers in front of us. And the Camach itself, you could just about see it. It's that blue line there in the southwest, coming in and basically tying in there into the Liffey around Kilmainham. In total, the Camach is about 10 kilometers long, and it moves from Mount Seskin down through Baldonnel, through the different landscapes, quite agrarian, and then very, very beautiful. And then gradually into Sogart and Inchicore, in through the suburbs, and eventually into Kilmainham, into more high density locations. And you can begin to see that the landscape changes dramatically as the river progresses down towards the city. So we were really focusing a lot on this area here in Inchicore and Kilmainham, in particular to see what the river was actually doing in that particular part of the city. And you can see here from the 2 maps, we have left and right a map from the 1900s, 1920. And the dark gray area is the city. And you can see here how it looks in 2010. And essentially, there's a number of things which we notice here. We see that the city has expanded enormously, of course, up and through the river, all these dark gray areas. You see also that the tributaries into the river have become disconnected in many parts, and are actually not part of the river system anymore. And you also see these little red lines, these little red dots in here. And this is where the river has been undergrounded and also channeled as well. So the actual working of the river has changed dramatically in this short period of time. It's maybe 100 years, but it's a considerable transformation of that entire landscape. And as an example of that, you could look at how the landscape used to look with the river in 1910. And this is that Foxton Geese. And you can see this dark blue contour, which is the old flooding zone. And you can see that actually very clearly in the old maps, and how settlements generally tend to stay out of that zone, and how roads and infrastructure in the countryside were designed around these natural flooding events that the river had. You also see these purple areas. These are the old mills that would have used the power of the river itself to power the mills. And if we look at the same area now, you can see that the city has really developed right into the flood zone of the river, and of course all around it as well. And that is a considerable change. So it's not really surprising, therefore, that we are experiencing a lot of this flooding that's happening. And it's getting more extreme. As you know yourselves, there's peaks, and the pattern of the climate is changing. So we're experiencing much more severe events at different times of the year. So these are examples, for example, in Kilmainham that are happening. And so at the moment, the OPW is proposing a plan, and they have a particular approach which they're using. And this is an example in this river. The red lines are actually walls, and this will hold back the water for a certain amount of time. But ultimately, these solutions aren't really sustainable, because the climate change is not changing, and the water and the effects of climate change are going to continue to increase, which means we will have to raise the walls and raise the walls. And this is basically a non-sustainable approach, but a very important approach in the short term for providing a level of protection to houses and homes and to people's livelihoods. So it is also very important. So if we look here at these walls at the moment, we can see there's about 10 kilometers of walls costing about 18 million. But the interesting thing is the river is 10 kilometers long. So what we're really proposing here is essentially almost a wall all the way along the river. And of course, this is perhaps not the ideal approach. So we wanted to think about how that river was actually experienced when you build the walls. And you can see here, these are some of the walls along here. So they are providing protection. But you can see that they kind of lack spatial quality, and they certainly don't improve the biodiversity in the river. They cut off that very important transition edge of the river to the land, and all all those ecosystems within there as well. And that's a very abrupt disconnect from the river really to the surrounding landscape itself. So we wanted to take a step back and think about how was the river actually experienced in the landscape? How do people see that? So we began to walk all the way along the river and looked at different points. And here, for example, we were in Drimna, and we were saying, okay, there's the Camach, it's in behind that wall. And then we moved on again out to Clondalkin, and we discovered that, as you can see, the river is down there behind those trees. So you see, there's no real connection there also in urban terms, or how are the housing facing onto that? Are they making any use of that river? We could see that that really wasn't happening. And if you go out towards the Naas Road, for example, there was a hotel located near the Camach. We thought maybe that was going to tie in more closely. But even there, the use of the river, the amenity value of the river, wasn't even perhaps being capitalized on either. So, and then we went out to Bluebell, and that's where locations where the river is in fact completely undergrounded, and where it disappears entirely for large stretches itself. And essentially, we basically said there has to be obviously a different approach to this, and maybe we could also add not just flood protection, but also extra benefits, multiple benefits. So spatial quality, biodiversity, and also just a better quality of life, a better living surroundings. So we developed a short vision statement, and we said, how can we provide flood protection, but also make it a much more of a visible asset, and looking at the Camach specifically, and how can we combine this with water storage, with green infrastructure, and combine it also with living and recreation, and also working. And there's a very nice example here you can see in the images of Getty Square in New York, and you can see the situation here in 1917 when the river was put into a large tunnel, essentially. And later, in later years, it was actually daylighted and opened right up. And you can see that transition between the city and that connection between the city and the river and how beneficial that can be in this location. And so to do that, we had basically a look at the quantity of water that would be required, and essentially for taking off that peak. So we wanted to reduce 1 in 100-year events down to 1 in 10-year events as a starting point. And that would solve most of the flooding issues at hand at the moment along the Camach. So that's for about 6 hours. So roughly that means about 60 hectares of area we're looking for to store about a meter of water. And we took that and we basically looked at all the green locations along the river. You can see them here. And we discovered there was about 48 hectares of green areas that were actually, in theory, possible to use to store. And the actual storage of the water can't just happen at one point. It has to happen along the river to follow the volumetric flow of the river itself. So it has to be spread out along the river itself. And then we began to explore how that storage could actually take place. So we looked at different approaches to the flood protection itself. So we looked at a few locations and we used these principles, overflow and retain, for example, where the river can flow into an area, be held temporarily, and then flow back into the river itself. An extra river arm, something similar, so flowing away from the river, creating a new river around that, and allowing the area in between to flood, and also just collecting and retaining and allowing that water to drain. And also then stopping the river at some points, making it more narrow so the areas behind that area then actually can actually flood as well, and that slow down the flow. So we used these different strategies and we looked at 2 sites. So this is in Clondalkin, Kirka Domain. And this is already part of a public park area. And essentially we discovered that the existing situation used to have more river arms around here. And you can see that there's a sports pitches here in this area here. And here, for example, there's large green areas at the moment, which are mowed grasslands, not that well used in general, but generally speaking, wonderful asset to have, but could be more diverse, for example, in its appearance. And so what we did is we actually reduced the levels of the park roughly by a meter, and we used that land elsewhere. And then we put back the functions that were there already. So, for example, the sports pitches, the different amenity areas, etc. And sometimes we also changed the appearance of those areas. So we actually dropped it by about 1.5 meter, 1.5 meters in a different area as well. And essentially what happened is then we could use these areas much better for flooding as a result of that. So these became new storage areas. And I believe we were able to store something about 5 hectares within this particular area itself. So you see here, for example, this is the existing site. This is the river here. These are some of the large amenity areas here at the moment. And after reshaping the landscape, we were able to develop a much wider corridor for the river itself to give it much more space for erosion and deposition. We create much more naturalized areas that could consistently flood and create a different kind of vegetation and a different kind of biodiversity. And we also then used a lot of the ground removed from there to kind of build up areas, higher areas, to tie into the housing areas surrounding it, and creating woodlands essentially and walking routes around the edges of the park itself, and creating probably an interesting intermediary between the housing areas and the roads and also the park itself. And of course, you can begin to take this to all different levels in terms of the spatial design, but this was just a quick example. And then as that floods, these areas then can be used, they can be retained, and that water can then begin to flow back into the river, thereby producing, in this case, it was 10 to 15 hectares of storage for this location itself. And again, there's different examples of how these kinds of parks can work. In France, you have some very good examples where the parks have been designed and redesigned essentially to hold a lot more water. And they also change significantly in their appearance and in their attractiveness as well. So there are different kinds of locations, different kinds of parks. The second location was in Inchicore, and we essentially looked at this area here. This used to be, again, an old river arm in this location. And you can see now that it's an industrialized area, kind of like a brownfield site at this stage, underutilized and ready for redevelopment. And we have a little cross section here of the model itself. So you can see that this is the river here itself, and these areas are experiencing flooding, these industrial units here. And what we there suggested was that in the first instance, we could actually open up this area here and create a small levee or a small dike, and allowing a movement along here, sustainable movement in the form of walking or even cycling along the actual edge of the river as it now stands. And the second step, which we would take, is to reintroduce the river arm in some shape or form along the edge of these industrial units and bringing it back in here. So this could create a second route through the landscape as well, and allow more storage of water within that river arm itself, a bypass essentially. And thirdly, then we could actually redesign the entire central area in time into a residential area. And the idea here is obviously to create new housing and allow the area surrounding that to actually flood itself. So it's an incremental approach. And essentially it's geared at reshaping some of these industrial units, but actually at the same time taking the opportunity to open up the river, to reconnect it, and to allow new areas to emerge around the river and new landscapes that can actually link in and continue along the Camach itself. So you can see that this is the existing location. You can see the river here kind of channeled in a lot of the parts, gradually moving through that area, vast swathes of asphalt here, you can see, ready for change and ready for reuse. It's really not that well used at the moment in all these locations. And step two is then to actually develop all these different incremental steps to come to this image here as well. So you can see new housing develop, but primarily allowing the river to flow around and create these new flooding landscapes around the housing itself. So flooding areas, high density dwellings, a river arm, essentially with woodland areas along the edges, new pathways and new infrastructure, also for the new residents of these locations as well to tie in, and thereby step by step using all these incremental ways of actually connecting the River Camach itself over time. So this was in theory able to store between 5 and 6 hectares of water as part of that 40 something hectares we were discussing. So this was an example again of an integrated approach to this whole idea of flood protection, really looking at the landscape and the river as the basis, and beginning to fashion your city around that in terms of amenity. But it's very important at the same time to develop a master plan around that. So essentially what we were trying to suggest is that instead of putting monies directly into walls, that we felt it would be much more sustainable to actually divert monies into the development of green infrastructure. And that, of course, is quite difficult in many ways because it means that you have to work wider than the footprint of the river. You have to work outside of the very small legal boundaries that the OPW actually has. You have to reach out, you have to form alliances with landowners, with the city, with the residents, and you have to form essentially a master plan for the whole area and work on that together on a step-by-step basis. But the idea is to absolutely revitalize rivers like the Camach and generate new values for the city as a green resource and as a motor for, in this case, as a motor for regeneration itself. A very important part of that process and that whole idea is, in fact, to develop a master plan. So the point is that everybody has to work towards a general goal, and the master plan is a moving, dynamic piece of work. It's not set in stone, but it does set out the kind of ambitions that need to be achieved and where the possibilities could emerge. For example, the ideas of water storage and sharing, and what sort of green could be developed, and what sort of other activities in the city could be developed, whether it's housing or whether it's new storage areas or whether it's amenity, for example, and how the actual parts of the city can be changed as well, and what sort of routes could be adapted and added into the entire approach. So this is a kind of approach that we would use commonly in the Netherlands, where I also work, and essentially it's a very different approach in many respects because it takes a step back And like most designers, we don't work in a linear way towards a problem, very much like engineers do. We take a step back and we work in an iterative way towards a solution. In other words, we imagine and dream about how wonderful that solution could be. And then we begin to reiterate our designs to see how we could achieve that as we move through time and also through the city itself, and see what ways we could apply to actually achieve those different ambitions.
2 minutes, Patrick, please.
Okay, this is the last slide. Well, these are some of our recommendations that we had, and again, there's a link here to this report if anybody's interested. It's on the slide here, so anyone can download it here. And essentially, our request, I suppose, is in general to the policymakers and to everybody, to residents, is to reframe the question of flood protection to a sustainable, integrated vision, to improve biodiversity in our cities, to see the rivers and flood protection actually as a catalyst for development, to see it as something positive, to develop recreational networks and new economies. We absolutely recommend the idea of producing some kind of master plan for the river and transforming the cities to accommodate the rivers. So, and also designing flood protection beyond the current footprints of the rivers by developing alliances with stakeholders and landowners and people around the river. And finally, we would encourage very much local authorities to try and lead these initiatives. We feel that they have the most intimate knowledge of the area and the residents, and we think that they are very well suited to actually leading these initiatives themselves. Porrick, back to yourself.
Thanks very much, Patrick. Really, really fascinating stuff. You know, it's just amazing what I think we can achieve if we just look at things in a different way, and even just looking at some of the pictures there, you know, it's phenomenal. The just the visual relief of the greenery compared to the acres of hard surfaces and all that's in the city. So thank you very much for that, Patrick. So I'll ask you to stop sharing your screen, please. Thank you very much. And we'll move on to our last speaker, last but not least. Lorraine Bull is the Biodiversity Officer with Dublin City Council. And Lorraine is a former staff with the Irish Wildlife Trust, so we really produce very high quality people going out into the world. And Lorraine is going to discuss some of the projects from the City Biodiversity Action Plan and how the plan works to help nature across the city. So over to you, Lorraine, in your own time. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Porrick, and hello to everyone this evening. So as Porrick was saying, I'm Lorraine. I'm the Biodiversity Officer with Dublin City Council. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the action plan and some of the projects that we're doing. Our current action plan is up for review, so I'll talk to you a little bit about that as we go through as well. So really, across the city, the local authority biodiversity action plans come or feed from the National Biodiversity Action Plan. We're also in a biodiversity and climate crisis here in Ireland, which a lot of you may know. So Dublin City Council had its first action plan back in 2008. This was then reviewed and updated back in 2015. And here we are now in 2021 updating the action plan as well. Although the action plan is dated 2020 through the city development plan, it's still legally enforceable. So it's still in play. It hasn't gone away. But as I say, we're going to be working across a review of the action plan to update it. So the current plan has been spread across 4 themes, and we might stick with some of these themes, or we might make it a little bit more action-led. So really these themes are strengthening knowledge base of decision makers for the conservation and management of biodiversity. So really, in order to protect something, you need to know about it. You need to know what species are there, what habitats are there, and what the potential problems are or issues are with their conservation. Also then working with collaboration with a lot of stakeholders. That's really crucial, from local authorities working with other local authorities, you know, other groups, and also members of the community as well. Enhancing opportunity for biodiversity conservation through green infrastructure is also part of the plan as well. and then also developing greater awareness and understanding of biodiversity. Now, we've seen a lot, during COVID, that people's awareness has been raised, and we've got research that backs that up as well. But there's always scope to do more on that. So really, there's policies as part of the BAP, and really these, in a nutshell, are looking at complying with biodiversity legislation and incorporating biodiversity conservation at the earliest possible stage. So we actually, part of stakeholders that we liaise with all the time, include National Parks and Wildlife Service, and we're record data and monitor data that feeds into national data sets. We also look for the highest standards in biodiversity conservation and to adopt and evaluate best practice management. So really, a lot of the research that we conduct, there's then actions that come out of that and advice that come out of that from the consultants, and that goes into our management practices. Again, working collaboratively with stakeholders, as I mentioned before, and then promoting and supporting biodiversity research. So really, biodiversity research is really crucial, as I was saying, about you need to know what's there in order to protect it. So some examples of this, and this really isn't the full definitive list. The definitive list is a lot longer. In the current BAP, theme number 1, strengthening knowledge, there's 17 actions, but some of these actions are multi-layered. So some of the research projects are taken over a 2 to 3 year period. So it takes a while to actually gather the data. So we've just actually, literally in the last few months, revised the Dublin City Habitat Map. So that was updated from 2010. So we now have a picture of where our habitats are across the city. We've also updated the Woodland and Hedgerow survey, and that was last done back in 2006. We've mapped flora protection order species and also areas of conservation value in 50 of our parks. We've got Otter Survey. I saw somebody had a question about otters, so I'll be able to answer some of that. We did an Otter Survey of the city. Grey wagtail and kingfisher surveys. We looked at the eelgrass or the zostera beds out in Sandymount, and we'll be doing more work on that as well. And also we've been piloting pond restoration projects. We've done flora and vegetation surveys, disturbance of seals on North Bull Island, looking at the ground nesting birds of North Bull Island, which we'll be doing more work on with Birdwatch this year. There's also mammal survey. And then there's also annual surveys. So the National Biodiversity Data Centre go to do marsh fertility surveys with on Bull Island, and some of our volunteers get involved in that. So this is the habitat mapping project. I don't know if you can see all of this just with the screen here. I'm going to minimize myself. So we've actually got, as I say, a full updated definitive map of the city. The number 1 habitat that we have is actually people's back gardens at about 28%. So that's also something that's really going to feed into the new action plan. I've been doing quite a lot of work with community groups, both for local areas, but also what people can also do at home to help biodiversity. Alma was talking about the tree mapping project. So I had this in really just to highlight about the app and about using the app. So Alma actually talked about the study that was undertaken by UCD, which, as she explained, was doing the canopy across the city. So then the Curio app, if you actually go on to, somebody asked there about whether or not you could get it on the iPhone, and you certainly can. So this is actually Ludo, our tree officer, and he's using the app. So you can go into a park, you can go into any area of Dublin, and you can actually see, which specific tree, if it's been mapped, what the species of tree is. And as Alma was saying, it'd be really great if people are using the app either in, in their local area, but particularly in gardens as well, so that we can actually map more trees across Dublin. Oh, and just to say on that, we've actually got an instructional webinar as well. So if anybody, you can email me and I can send you the link to that. We did a Dublin Otter Survey as part of this current BAP. And really that was to provide a baseline information about the otter populations and also map the distribution across Dublin City. And this was the first time such a comprehensive study was done. There's been other citizen science, which actually the Wildlife Trust were involved in, that looked at otter. We also wanted to look at the role of human disturbance and how this impacted on otter sign. Excuse me. And we also wanted to highlight the most undisturbed areas of the river channel. And really from this, how we use these plans and how we use these research studies is we actually look at the information that's there. We look at the distribution of species. We look at the number of species. You know, if there's any particular issues with the habitats they're in. And then a lot of the reports and studies will then actually have conclusions about where we can actually focus our conservation efforts, because you know, resources are always limited, whether that be people and obviously money. And really part of these action plans is to actually look at those strategies and those outputs from those projects in order to help various species. So this was comprehensive. I mean, it's over 128 kilometers of habitat. It was 14 rivers and also the coastal boundary. And there were different techniques. So there was, they actually looked at the total corridor. They also looked at the hydromorphology of the river and also a human disturbance index. Now this study is available to have a look on our website if you'd like to find out more information, but the outcomes from this, as I say, are feeding in directly to this new BAP. There were found 196 otter signs. So this could be spraints, this could be you know, slides. So when an otter is actually sliding down into a river, this could be prints. There were also halts recorded as well. I haven't actually indicated where they are because obviously they're protected, so that's why things are covered. But it's just to say there is actually a distribution of otters across the city. We also work in partnership. So part of theme 2 was working in collaboration, and those partnerships will be continuing the new BAP. So we work with the Dublin Bay Biosphere Partnership. So if any of you are not aware, Dublin Bay is designated as a UNESCO Biosphere. As part of this, there's conservation and research strategies that come out of that, and they actually work both within each local authority. So that would be ourselves, Fingal and Dún Laoghaire, but also then Bay-wide as well. So there's a couple of key projects that are going to be starting in the next year or so. They were due to start last year, but because of COVID, they've had to have been delayed, and that's going to enable us to find out how species are using the bay across all of the different local authorities. We also do a lot of annual biodiversity awareness. You know, around cities, rivers and canals. We need to do a bit more of that as well with our Water Framework Office. And we work also with the Dublin Mountains Partnership. So you might have seen recently there's Quilcher Nature doing a big initiative there in the Dublin Mountains. And we actually sit on that partnership board and feed into that as well. So green infrastructure is also a theme of the BAP. And will continue obviously to get stronger and stronger, and promoting ecosystem services across the city. So some of those projects, you know, managing river valleys, Tolka Liffey Sanctuary, there's a sanctuary rehabilitation project that is underway. And as part of, we're working with the engineering and water section in DCC. And part of that, we actually did a study with Birdwatch to look at the birds and the riparian zone. So that's the zone along the riverbank. We've also worked, constructed wetlands, looking at where we share boundaries with other local authorities, includes for invasive species as well. And we prioritise conservation and management actions as part of a green infrastructure network. Then I guess the fun bit, well, certainly for me anyway, is doing the engagement with communities and also interest groups. So in the current BAP, there's been 6 actions on that, but top left corner there, that's our North Bull Island volunteer programme. So we have a team of volunteers. With COVID again, that's been seriously curtailed, but they do a lot of initiatives on the island. They do a lot of survey work. They do workshops and they do tours for members of the public. In the middle there's Explore Your Shore. So that's actually a National Biodiversity Data Centre initiative that was launched down on Bull Island, and we feed into that. We also do events at Battle for the Bay, the Rose Festival, tree walks, you know, school sessions. We had an event at the Red Stables about sustainable development. So I wanted to show you this because this is also as part of our outreach program. We actually do resources as well. So this is a resource that was launched, well, it would have been 2019 at this stage now, but this is a resource for schools. But you could actually use this, parents, sorry, could actually use this with their kids going into parks or going out into nature. And there's various guides there. So this is on our website. And if anybody wants to email me, I'll be able to send them the information for that. Then we've also got a new booklet that's out, a short guide to woodlands here in Dublin. We have a tree officer as part of the council. So just to say, the Biodiversity Action Plan doesn't stand alone. It feeds into the city development plan, but there's also other plans that we have. There's tree strategy, so that sets out the vision for the management of public trees, and we have a tree officer. We also have a parks strategy, which actually looks at landscape development and future management. And then there's various greening strategies across the city. Some of you might have heard of the Stony Batter. There was a lot of workshops, public workshops on that. And then also there's a climate change action plans now across the city as well. And the biodiversity section also feeds into that. So there's nature-based solutions actions, there's flood resilience actions, there's resource management. And then we also liaise with other departments in terms of transport and things like that. We also had, it's not in the plan, but as part of parks, we also had a herbicide policy in place since 2018, and that was to eliminate the use of glyphosate. We have to still use it for invasive species, but instead of a mass spraying of this, we actually look to inject the invasive. There's also management methods, alternative management methods used. So you can see there in the bottom picture, a lot of that area has just been allowed to grow. And then there's certain areas that are mowed so that people can walk through it, or it's just a bit neater at the edges. And that really provides a huge amount of habitat for pollinators, but also for a range of other insect species as well, which feed a lot of other animals. There's also increased planting for pollinators that we've done. So there was a radical shift. It used to be a sort of a 70% ornamental planting and 30% planting for pollinators, and now it's 80% planting for pollinators and only 20% are more of the ornamental, and that's across the city. And then there's been a shift in mowing regimes across the city as well, so reducing mowing and actually increasing the height of the cut, and all of those initiatives actually help pollinating species. And you can see some of the planting there in St Anne's Park. So really, we have, as I say, this action plan. We're reviewing it at the moment, and part of actually me wanting to do the talk with yourselves is we are working with stakeholders. We've got a stakeholder forum, but we will be putting this draft out for publication in National Biodiversity Week. So the review's underway. We did a questionnaire there, Your Dublin, Your Voice questionnaire just before Christmas. And we actually got a lot of information from that as well. As I say, we've got a stakeholder forum of IWT is part of, including universities, other NGOs and other interest groups in the city. We're doing the draft map out for public consultation in National Biodiversity Week in May, and we'll be looking for public submissions. We're also then feeding into the city development plan in June. And then by the time we get the submissions back and that goes through the processes in the council, the final publication we anticipate will be October. So really the Biodiversity Action Plan, as I say, it's a plan for the city. It doesn't stand alone. There are other initiatives, and a lot of the gardeners in the parks will do initiatives as well for biodiversity. And one thing also just to say from the biodiversity section is also submissions. We make submissions to planning applications. So if there's a planning application that comes in, we will actually review that for biodiversity as well, and Marianne Harris, who actually works in the council, she predominantly works on the planning projects, but sometimes I would look into that as well myself. So that's it. So thank you for listening. My email is biodiversity@dublincity.ie. So if you do have any questions that we can't answer in today's session, or you've got any submissions you want to make, or if you want more information about the BAP, then do get in touch. So I think that's it, Porrick. So back over to you.
Okay, thanks so much, Lorraine. Fascinating. I mean, I always find it's just amazing to think about the amount of wildlife that exists within the city boundaries. It is incredible when you look at the pictures. Wonderful diversity and color and all of these things out there sharing our spaces with us.
I mean, that's one thing I actually wasn't touching on, obviously, because the audience, but yeah, we are actually very lucky in Dublin. We have a huge range of biodiversity, and we have a lot of marine fauna as well, as you'll know, out in the bay. So yeah, we're in a very unique position.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I hope people will engage with the new biodiversity action plan, and we'll certainly share that through our social media. So thank you very much to all the speakers. We've got a couple of minutes now for some questions, and we have lots of questions coming in. And maybe Lorraine, I'll ask you to stop sharing your screen, please.
Okay.
If you don't mind, and we'll get all our speakers back where we can see them.
Sorry about this. Hang on. Okay, how do I do that? Yeah.
Okay,
so
you're figuring that out. I'll ask Alma if you're still there. Alma, Bridget is asking, how do you see your findings feeding into land use plans? So these would be local area plans or county development plans that tend to make a lot of decisions about where development goes and what happens where, and how do you propose to reconcile existing land zoning with your recommendations?
Okay, yep. So two questions there, I suppose. Well, because the research is funded by the Environmental Protection Agency, we are required in a way to be policy relevant. So we were very mindful of that from the outset. So at the same time as creating a space for the community to articulating their greening needs, of course, we wanted to be in conversation with DCC and Waterways Ireland. And I suppose in a way we're lucky. I suppose there's a sort of a planning policy gap at the moment. We have a new iteration of the Dublin city plan. We have a number of master plans in the area associated with the housing complexes. There's the Camach core development framework, and an array of new plans coming up next year associated with the canals. So we are in conversation with all of these stakeholders, and we intentionally liaised with Dublin City Council and Parks and Biodiversity last year, and also Waterways Ireland, to let them know what we were doing and to ensure we were policy relevant. And the hope is that they can use at least the data or some of the findings of the recommendations as a sort of an evidence base when they're bringing their case forward in the new plan. And of course, we can make our own assertions in that way. In terms of the zoning, that is quite a tricky question. Of course, we are purporting a much more sort of holistic landscape-led approach to greening in Dublin 8 and beyond, which isn't seen at the moment. So we have this sort of the strict zoning tools in the area and a focus on the zoning tools and also on master plans. So of course, some of our bigger and more ambitious recommendations are around more landscape-led planning, even though we are not landscape architects, we are geographers, but a more holistic approach to greening in the future.
Thanks very much, Alma. Patrick, I have a question here for you about your study on the Camach. And number one, did you look at the cost of doing that, and how did it compare to the? Did you say it was going to be 18 million or something to put up 10 kilometers of walls? How does your softer approach compare cost-wise?
Well, we didn't directly compare the costs, Porrick, to be honest. So I don't have a definitive answer to that. But one thing we do know from experience is that all these downstream hard solutions, they tend to be very expensive because you're building in one of the most difficult areas. They're highly engineered. They require a lot of delicate work, and essentially they're very expensive. So everybody knows that investing into green, typically green and soft landscape, is ultimately a lot cheaper than into hard works and engineering. So the idea is, of course, is that obviously in the long term, we want to really encourage this approach, because we do realize that in the short term, walls will be necessary. But this is a problem which is not going away. And it really means that the entire appearance of our towns and cities throughout the country are going to be very much affected, right? Small towns, small villages throughout the entire country are going to be very affected by this. And what we really want to avoid is a continuous, if you like, disconnection with the river, where new visual objects in the form of walls will essentially close off the rivers from the public realm, from people in those towns and villages. And that was the origin really of the settlements and of the towns.
And another aspect of that, another question on your talk really was, did your study seemed to look at storage capacity for water? Did you give any thought to the land uses or the types of green spaces that may be happening elsewhere in the catchment, or the type of green space that you have, like trees versus mown grass or any of that?
Yeah, we did, but at a fairly abstract level at the same time. But we certainly know from similar projects that they're working out in other locations that we mentioned the riparian zones, obviously the kinds of vegetation, wet meadows, and all the different kinds of ecologies that you have to really provide a full gradient there from woodlands right down to open water. And so you can develop your ecological systems within that and increase the biodiversity. So that's something which is, it's potentially there to be developed. So we know that the space is there. We know that the soils are there to also develop different kinds of woodlands, different kinds of vegetation. So it's there for the taking, really. So there's plenty of opportunity. But we didn't work them all out into a kind of a proper ecological system as yet. No.
Okay. And has your project finished? Have you delivered your findings?
Yeah, our project has been finished, and this is just one small part of the project, I would say. So there are other case studies as part of that. So there has been a summary report of MADE, and that is the one that's in the link at the end. But essentially, it has now been used really to encourage engineers, primarily, I would suggest, together with planners and also with policymakers and ecologists, and essentially everyone to maybe begin to look at this again and to see what the options are moving forward. See if there's any possibilities for master planning these larger visions, which ultimately we just want the very simple things in life. We want to be able to walk along the Camach and be able to just walk up to Mount Seskin from our city, and the same for all the rivers. And we want people to use common sense and to basically organize and reorganize new green structure onto these existing blue structures, and to bring back and the disconnections, to repair those disconnections that have happened. And this isn't just in the city, by the way. So these are also along other rivers in the country, in rural areas as well. And we're certainly very interested in trying to improve the amenity value, the access along these rivers. Very often they're along private agricultural land. So that brings a whole set of other issues with it. But trying to improve the accessibility and also the biodiversity along there, and get farmers involved, get land owners involved in participating in obviously pollinator zones, but also replanting and the management of the margins of the rivers and those areas as well. So we think there's a win-win across the board.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it's always amazing anytime I hear about these nature-based solutions, how multifaceted their benefits are. You know, they really are quite far-reaching.
Yeah.
Lorraine, well, there's a question from Paul. I think you partly answered it in your talk. He was talking about the otters in the city, and certainly I've can't believe how the last time I saw an otter was swimming under the Halfpenny Bridge, coming home from the pub. The last time I remember going to the pub, so it's quite incredible how close otters now are and how frequently they're seen in the city. But they are considered then in planning applications and when new developments are planned.
Yeah, so the Grand Canal Dock area is a waterways island. Now we liaise with Waterways Island, on various projects. But when there's any development applications, which there have been during my time at the council, I've read them and submitted to them. We actually will put in what we call various conditions. So in terms of just how the planning process works, planning applications will come to the biodiversity desk, and they'll also go to landscape architects as well to have a look at the layout and plan of a new development. And we'll then look at appropriate assessments that have been done, environmental impact statements that have been done, and actually then make a series of conditions that then goes to On Board Planola, and they make the final decision on that. But we put in as many recommendations as we can. I guess, sometimes when people are looking at what we're doing for biodiversity, is maybe they don't see the resources that are behind it as well, or the various submissions that people make, yourselves included.
Sure. Linda O'Dwyer has asked a question, and I think it's very, very relevant to the times we live in. And she asks, how will the needs of people in Dublin be met without substantially impacting wildlife habitats? And in particular, we've all seen huge demand for use of green space, and people may not realize that particularly the coastal parts of Dublin are subjected to some fairly strict protection under the Habitats Directive and for biodiversity. Yet there's also this competing need and want to use these spaces for recreation. Can you talk a little bit about how we can resolve those conflicts, particularly maybe around Bull Island? Might be a good example.
Well, I think as on Bull Island, but also in other areas as well, a lot of that is education. So we deal with this, quite often. We'll have a lot of groups that will want to use either Bull Island or some of the other parks. So the parks, they have an amenity value. Bull Island itself, it's a national nature reserve, but it has that amenity value to it as well. So that's part of the work we're doing. There's a Bull Island management plan, which is out at the moment. There's a forum out in Clontarf that's actually looking at the management plan for the island, and it's really to look at all of the different so we've got in the last couple of months in particular a lot of requests for using drones on the island, which isn't allowed, and that's another consideration going into the future. They can cause disturbance, but like that, the kite surfers and the swimmers and everything else. So part of it is education, informing people. So like the northern end of Bull Island, where the seals are out resting during the day, communicating with people that those seals are actually trying to rest, and they'll need to rest for X amount of hours per day. And by wandering up there or by having your dog off lead, you're causing a negative impact to that animal, and also for the migratory birds as well. So some places there's the stick that's used, and we prefer the carrot option in terms of actually buying. So whether that's us in the council, but then also some of the other groups that we liaise with, like yourselves and Birdwatch and things like that, it's all part of a broader campaign. But I think ultimately that will be, unless you were to fence everywhere off, You know, that's the best method in terms of getting buy-in from members of the public in order to try and conserve the areas, and about getting that message. Now we do that a lot also through the Biosphere as well, and really just emphasising, you know, how important Dublin Bay is, and Bull Island as part of Dublin Bay. So.
Bull Island, of course, has nearly every designation going, and we've got a consultation out at the moment on marine protected areas. So maybe Dublin Bay will become a marine protected area into the future. So that might be nice.
Well, for my own personal, as you know, marine mammals are they're my thing really, but as well as other species. So yes, you know, it is such a crucial site. I mean, Bull Island's the most designated site in the country, and even when you look at it from an international scale, it's like having the equivalent of the Serengeti on our doorstep in terms of its importance. So it really is crucial. But for a lot of people growing up, it's the place that, you know, their grandparents took them to build sandcastles, you know. And there's also the heritage value for the island as well. So
yeah, absolutely, hugely important. Alma, just slightly related to the issue of access, Jody is asking how accessible are the green spaces in Dublin 8, and what is being done to promote physical and sensory accessibility? And just maybe just from my own observation, I noticed these kissing gates are getting quite a lot of attention these days. And I know I live near the canals, and these gates were brought in to stop you know, motorbikes and, you know, quad bikes and stuff using it, but they can create accessibility issues as well. So is that something you looked at in your study?
Well, connectivity and access was one of the main points that came up in the recommendations. And of course, this has all been completely magnified over the last year because more people are using the canal, and more people are out walking within the area. Initially, I suppose, and this is why I was making the point about constructive collaboration. So, you know, we had a sort of finite 1.5-year project, and we started off looking at trees, with, you know, which are point data, and then canopy. And I was just discussing with Lorraine recently about, you know, connecting up all of the expertise within the area, including dimensions of walkability and cyclability, but access and connectivity was one of the main issues, particularly accessibility and, you know, maintenance along the canal was a major issue. So that's something we're going to be flagging in the recommendations. It looks in the future that there are efforts in place to enhance connectivity, and hopefully in the Kilmainham Inchicore development strategy. So hopefully efforts to link the Camach with the canal and enhance walkability in the future.
Great, thanks. So look, we've time for one more question, Patrick, for you. I'm going to ask you about climate change, which you mentioned, and I've seen some of the drawings of Dublin, even in 2050, never mind 2100, really look quite scary, to be honest. I mean, did you you obviously looked at climate change in your study? Is what you're proposing climate proofed, or how did you manage to include climate in your analysis?
We basically worked off the protection levels that were recommended by the OPW. So the basically 1 to 100-year events and upwards, 1 to 200-year events. So that's essentially the milestone that we were using for testing all these different the different models. So we don't do all the water models themselves; they're all done by engineering companies. But it is interesting to note that obviously Dublin Bay, I'm not exactly up to date on all the exact information, but it's certainly rising much more quickly than expectations. So it is quite dramatic what's happening there. So yeah, so that's essentially the kinds of statistics that we're using. If you look at the Netherlands, they have very different kinds of safety measures. So they would have 1 to 1,000-year events, for example, much higher in a sense. Obviously, because there's a lot more damage as a result if there's any kind of breaches of the primary dike system itself. So yeah, we haven't had any kind of new kind of critical look at that. The OPW is manages all that. Yeah.
Very good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So look, thank you very much to all of you. I think that was a really wonderful discussion and certainly fantastic presentations. Lots of opportunities, I think, presenting to us challenges as well. But it's wonderful to hear about all the work that's being done. Thank you to everyone at home who's tuned in. Just to remind you to go to the Irish Wildlife Trust website to find out more about us and consider joining and becoming a member of the IWT. And just to plug my own project, Shaping New Mountains, is on the Irish Wildlife Trust website at the moment. And my most recent episode looks at nature in Dublin and all the things that we could possibly do to bring nature and wildlife back into our lives in the city. So thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you again next month, hopefully, where we have a very exciting webinar on a totally different topic for people next month. So I hope to see you virtually then. Thank you again, and good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Porrick. Thank you.